Hi, my name is Katie Hutter, and today we're going to be painting this beautiful little Aussie puppy. So grab your paintbrushes, your paints, your canvas, your paint thinner, your paper towels, everything that you're going to need to get this going. Now, you can start by doing just a quick little preliminary sketch, and I will include a copy of the reference photo that I used for this. And you're going to want to just go ahead and get that sketched out. I used just a little bit of black paint to get that kind of started, and got like some marks in there, and so that way I was able to get started on that. And here's your reference photo. Notice I've included color blocks to help you match some of the colors. There's like a tawny color, a bright white, and then a cool gray blue. The colors we're going to be using today are the warm and cool primaries, including cadmium red medium, alizarin crimson, cad yellow deep, lemon yellow, cerulean blue, ultramarine blue, burnt umber, titanium white, and black. For brushes, we're going to use a 0 liner, number 4, number 8, and 14 filbert, a number 4, and a number 10 flat. The mixed colors will be orange with white and cerulean blue added, a range of warm and cool grays, and greens and yellows for the background. And then we're also going to mix some custom colors just so that we can get the dog looking exactly the way we want, including some reds. All right, let's get started on our dog. So we're going to be starting with that buff color that I talked about, which is essentially just orange or cadmium red and cadmium yellow deep mixed together. I added a little cerulean blue in order to create a little bit of a cooler side for the cheek, and a little tiny bit of ultramarine blue to the right side, so that way the dog looks has the shadow side as well. Gonna get in his little eyebrows, and I'm using that same buff color that I mixed. Now I'm using one of the grays that I had mixed, just using black and white and a little tiny bit of ultramarine blue, and I'm switching colors. Now I'm using a little bit more of the buff color added to the gray, so that way I can get in the little bit of pink area just by his nose. And the color that we're going to be adding now is a gray. So I'm creating the shadow side on the left-hand side of his face, right-hand side of the painting. And I'm making the shadow go a little bit lighter as it goes back to create a little bit of depth of field. And now I'm using one of the reds, the cadmium red, mixed with a little bit of alizarin crimson to paint his tongue. And I'm using some of the paint darker and some lighter, so I can create that three-dimensionality on his tongue. And when I'm painting, a lot of times I'll allow the colors to be lighter or darker depending on how I want it to be. I use some very dark gray to create the line of his mouth and the shadow line onto his tongue. Right now I'm using the number 4 filbert, which is a hog hair bristle brush, which will indeed allow me to get in some nice firm brush marks. And I'm using a cool gray on the top of his head, which is a very much a lighter gray. So I've taken that medium gray and add a little bit more white to it and a little more cerulean blue to make it lighter. And as you're painting, you want to kind of shift your colors almost constantly. And I'm using black now to put his little pads on his feet on the bottom. And now I'm going to be kind of redefining those pads just a little bit. They're on an angle. I made them a little darker, so I add a little more black. And now I'm using a little bit more of the black color to kind of define around his eyes. And put in a little bit of shadow around his eyes to kind of get that shape in there. And I'm using my number 0 liner brush so that way I can get a really fine detail in there. And you can see how the eye is now starting to pop. I'm going to need to add some cerulean blue and white to create that pale blue eye. And you have to be really careful as you go in there with the color. So that's why this number 0 liner brush is really nice. You can also use like a number 0 or a double 0 round. That would also work. The round brushes I find don't really keep their shape very well. So that's why I like the liner brushes. I find them a little bit more, a little bit easier to use because they tend to keep their shape a little bit better than the rounds. And always clean your brushes out really thoroughly in between your usage, so that way they stay nice. And you can use Dawn detergent when you're done rinsing them out with a thinner, so that way you can keep their shape, almost like sizing for fabric. So the Dawn, just put a little thin film of Dawn around the bristles, and that'll help them keep their shape. Now I've switched to the other eye. The other eye I'm using burnt umber with a little tiny bit of white added in there. So that way I can, you don't want the eye that's in shadow to be black. You want to give it a little bit of dimension. So just by shifting the color ever so slightly between light, medium, and dark, you can create the eye that's in shadow, but it will still have dimension. And the very last thing that I'll end up doing is adding a little bit of that white spot, but very tiny. And so right now I'm just adding a little bit of black around the eye to help create some definition. I'm putting in the little mark on the side of his cheek. And I'm adding in the black as well on the right side. Every time I put my hand down, it's because I'm shifting colors. So that should give you an idea about how often I need to shift colors, which is almost constant. I've now switched to the gray, the light, very light gray on the side of his face, which is white with a little bit of cerulean blue and a little tiny bit of black. So it's like basically a tinted white. So it reads almost as a white, but it's just got a little bit of color in it, tiny amount of color. So when you're mixing colors, whatever the dominant base of the color is, like in this case it's basically white, so you take white and then add just tiny amounts of color to it. I'm going in there to define that eye. The eye is the most important part of the portrait, and that way you capture that expression, because when you're looking at a dog portrait or a person portrait or any animal portrait, the eyes naturally gravitate towards the eyes. So that way when you're looking at the portrait, you want to make sure that you get those eyes really good, and the rest of it can almost fall apart on you, and you'll still have a really nice portrait just because you did so well on the eyes. And later on in the painting, I'm going to adjust his nose because I can tell it's out of alignment. So when you're painting portraits like dogs or animals or people, you want to make sure that the eyes, the nose, and the mouth are all in alignment with each other. And you can do that by creating what is known as the cross of the face, by putting a line across where the eyes go, a line across where the nose goes, and a line across horizontally where the mouth goes. And you can tell in the original sketch that that is indeed what I had. So I'm going back in and putting that real pale cerulean blue and white and a little tiny bit of ultramarine blue in there to get that in there. And now I've switched to black. But it's not a black. I've actually added, you really want to call it more of a gray, because I've added just a little bit of white to it. So it's kind of like a charcoal gray. So a nice dark or graphite gray. So it's dark, but not really a full-on black. Putting in some of the markings around his eye. He's a blue merle coat pattern. So when you're painting this, you're going to want to use like the nice number 0 liner brush, so that way you can get some of that texture of his hair in there. Getting in some more markings above his eye. And I'm using that medium gray that I had made with ultramarine blue, cerulean blue, and a little tiny bit of burnt umber in there. But it's really more of a cool gray. So it's going to be blue dominant and not so much with the brown in there. Defining the side of his face a little bit with that lighter color. Now I'm using some of that shadow tone to create the side edge of his fur, which I will correct later because I noticed that the side of his face was just a little too wide for him. So I will end up correcting that later by bringing the side of his face in a little bit tighter. I'm using, again, cerulean blue and white to create a little bit of a slightly grayish tone, and I use a little bit of ultramarine blue to knock it back a little bit. And now I'm using that paint, which is that gray, cool gray color, to create a little bit of marking on his face and also to shift from the dark color to that medium color and creating some definition on, notice I'm flicking the brush. The flicking of the brush will create some natural texture for the hairs, so that way it will look like he actually has some hair, because he's a puppy, so he's very fuzzy. And the stiff bristle brush, like the one that I'm using right now, it's a hog hair brush, it will actually give me that effect that I want by creating a little bit of stiffness. And so like the synthetic brushes aren't going to give you that because they're just kind of a little bit too floppy. So your nice thick bristle brushes are going to be able to do that for you. Okay, so now I'm coming in, reshaping the tongue a little bit to get the shape and the orientation that I want, using that same color to create some shape in the shadow of his shoulder. And because, you know, this is all done. You have to think about the fact that all paintings create the sensation of form using light and shadow, and that is done through warm and cool colors. Now on this side, this is a cooler shadow side, which I could do a warmer shadow side, but I really like the effect of the cerulean blue, a little bit of ultramarine blue, and white to create a very cool shadow side because the light is very strong in this photo, the reference photo that I'm using. So I'm mostly just going to take this same color and I'm going to block in all the shaded areas that are in shadow on this cute little pup. And I'm going to create some variations in tone depending on, because we're doing three-dimensionality, you have to change the tone depending on what's facing the light and what is getting really hidden in deep shadow or what is maybe catching just a little bit of light. Because when you're in an area that's in shadow, it's not going to be all super dark, but you're going to have a narrower range from light to dark depending on what you're actually going to see. So I have to vary some of that shadow color from slightly lighter to slightly darker, but the areas that are in full light are going to have much bigger contrast. So you can see I vary the color just a little bit in certain areas, like as I go closer to the front of the shoulder, it gets a little lighter. As I go back towards the other side of his body, which is opposite the light, it gets a little bit darker. Okay, I'm taking some of that same color and putting it on the high spots of his knee and the front of his leg. And I'm redefining that little heart. He actually had a little heart on the top of his knee, which was so cute. And this was a photo that I found on the internet. I apologize, I do not know who took the photo. If anybody knows who took the photo, I would love to give them credit, but unfortunately I do not know where I got the photo from, as this is a photo I've had for a while in my gallery of inspiration photos. I do like to keep an eye on where the photos come from, so that way I can give credit where credit is due. Add a little bit of that tan color underneath his black spot. And now I'm putting in a little bit of shadow as it rounds through there. And there's also some dark gray and some black tones just from his markings. And I went back to having that real dark, kind of blackish gray color to put in his little spots. And I'm using just the tip of my number 4 filbert so that I can get those little spots in there where they belong. And there's some real dark areas down here in that little crevice in between his body and his rear foot. Shifting the colors and then adding some darker tones there where he's got marks, creating a little bit of shadow. And again, I'm shifting those tones, light to dark, or should I say dark to light. Went back to the liner brush so that I could get a little bit more control. Sorry, my hand's in the way a bit there. And so I am creating the defined area on the bottom of his right leg, which would be on the left of the painting. Creating a little bit of texture for his fur. And you can already see, just by what I've done already, he's really starting to shape up. And I'm just kind of getting a fair amount of detail in here and creating a little bit of texture. Creating a little definition, little dots. He's got little dots, and I realized that I made that a little too dark, so I went back and got a lighter color, and I diffused some of that a little bit. Adding some marks where I see them. This is a portrait. And I'm also going to use that black to define the area around his tongue and his mouth. It's not a straight black though. I did add a little bit of cerulean blue and a little bit of burnt umber and a little tiny bit of white, so it's kind of like a deep gray. And defining the area around his nose. Checking around, seeing what else I need to adjust. Adding some dark lining around his tongue, as I saw it in the initial reference photo. I'm just really kind of helping that tongue pop and adding the marks in to define that area as I see them. And you have to be fairly careful in this area, so I have to kind of watch where I put my hand too. I don't want to put my hand in the paint. Now I could use a mahl stick, M-A-H-L, which will also allow me to do what I need to do, but I just do it this way. And the color that I used for his mouth was a dark gray using alizarin crimson, ultramarine blue, and a little bit of white and some black. So I create that area around his mouth, and then every once in a while I have to clean off my brush and go a little darker or a little lighter depending on how things shift, lighter or darker. Because the dog has, like most dogs, has kind of like a black area around his jowl. Just taking my time, really defining this area here as I see it. And cleaning off my brush, reloading with a different color. And now I'm back to the reds. And now his tongue goes from a cool red, which has more alizarin crimson, to a warmer red, which has the cadmium red medium, along with some white to create the pink. So it's going from kind of like a berry pink to a more orangey pink, depending on how the light is hitting it. So it goes from warm on the warm on the left side to cooler and darker on the shadow side, which is more on the right side. So I'm just kind of creating that three-dimensionality to his tongue using the different colors. And I grabbed a little bit more white to create the side of his tongue, because a dog has kind of like a little bit of a crease down the middle of the tongue. And so as there's a crease, it creates a little valley. And on one side of the valley that is facing the light, that will be lighter and brighter than the side of the valley that is away from the light. I'm really just kind of taking my time here with the different pinks and working to get that detail in that tongue. It was a little kind of hard to see in the photo, so I was trying to make sure that I got that dimensionality without making it look too defined. Okay, so now we're going to work on his right eye. And I'm going to make my brush really, really tiny by cleaning the hairs on the end and bringing it to a nice fine chiseled point. And I'm going to take a lighter color, not white, but like kind of a really pale gray, and get those little light spots in his shaded eye, because that eye is in shadow. So the light spots are not going to be that bright. So you have to be really gentle and careful. So you have just a little bit of spark of light in that eye, just enough to make it visible, but you don't want to overdo it. So very small, very selective parts of white to put into that eye. In fact, I didn't even use white, I used gray, because it's very easy to get that area, too big of a blotchy spot. So now I'm using that light color again, which is that kind of blue-gray color that I have that's very pale, and I'm creating some texture in his fur. And I darkened it a little bit because he's got some dark areas underneath his eye for the markings. And now I'm using that color to define his nose and change the shape a little bit. And sometimes, like when you make a mistake or an area of your paintbrush gets, out of where you want it to be, you can literally use your finger and just kind of smudge it or move it around a little bit. It's really defining that eye and moving the paint around to get the markings where I want them. And what I'm doing is going back and forth with my eyes to my reference photo, so that way I can see what I'm doing and see where things need to go. And I'm matching as best I can between what I see in the reference photo and what I'm seeing in the painting. And it's really kind of a hand-eye coordination, very fine motor skills, which is why oftentimes women can make better painters than men, because they usually are better tuned with their fine motor skills, but that's not always the case. Really, it's practice. So if you get a lot of practice in, you can actually do very well. And just, there's a lot of cute little fuzzy areas in there. So we're going to kind of create that. I'm going to see if I can add the picture in there so that way you can see what I'm referencing. Adding in his markings that are around his eyes and his face, checking for accuracy. And again, I'm not using black, I'm using ultramarine blue, black, and burnt umber, a combination of those. So that way it's a richer color. And sometimes I'll even add a little bit of white to it to make it lighter or darker depending on what I need. Like here I'm adding quite a bit more white. He's got a neat little swirled pattern over here, so I'm doing my best to replicate that pattern and create that texture that's in his coat. Now I'm adding the spots that's on his forearm using, again, not black, but a combination of black, ultramarine blue, and burnt umber. And I've added just a tiny little bit of white so it's not super, super dark. I want it to be more of like a deep graphite gray. And using the nice liner brush, which has a very fine point so that I can get the texture of the hair in there. And I can give them fuzzy edges. And I'm going over to his knee and then down on his pads on his foot, redefining some of those areas in his pad so that way you can really see them, and defining the shapes on his little pads. So I'm using that dark graphite gray to redefine the area of his pads, give it a little bit more shape and definition based on what I see in the reference photo. And I'm just checking the angles because I did notice that the angles of the pads are kind of almost like at a 45-degree angle and not straight upright, and they're also kind of oval shaped. And I'm going to do the same thing on the right hand side of the painting, or his left paw. When I say left paw, right paw, I'm not referring to his left paw or right paw. I'm referring to what is on the left side versus what is on the right side of the painting. So anytime you hear me refer to his left paw or his right paw, unless I define it differently, what I'm doing is I'm referring to the left side of the painting versus the right side of the painting. I'm now switching to my number 4 filbert again, which is a nice hog hair bristle brush. And I'm going to give it a lot of texture in the areas where I see the fur. So I'm using a deep ultramarine blue mixed with a little bit of white and a little tiny bit of alizarin crimson to give it kind of like a purplish color, which will give a really beautiful tone to that foot and give a really nice shadow color. Defining the areas around his back toes, putting a little separation between the toes. Creating a little definition on the top of his foot. So notice that I switched to a slightly lighter color. And I'm going to use this lighter color now to redefine some of the areas around the inside of his leg and create a little bit of texture here. When you're painting, it's this constant give and take of adjusting, readjusting, and micro adjusting, and sometimes macro adjusting, but usually it's micro adjusting. And the main difference between a painting that looks really finished and one that's not finished is the amount of adjusting and tweaking that you've done. I mean, you can stop at any point. I could stop now and basically call it, oh, the dog is done, and I could move on. But me being who I am, I tend to want to kind of, make it as close as I can. And now with any kind of a portrait, whether it's a dog portrait or person portrait or an animal portrait, you really want to kind of make sure that you're accurate in where the markings are, where how the facial expression is, and you can decide what you want that face to depict. Like, for example, I was given a portrait to do, a triple portrait in fact, and the face expression, the facial expressions were squinting from the sun. So I literally had to find references of their eyes and see what they looked like when they were doing normal smiles, and then superimpose that, complete with all the correct lighting and everything, which was no small task. So that way I could make the photo what I wanted it to be instead of just what it was. And that's really the magic of being an artist, is you take something that is maybe not so great and you turn it into a piece of art. The art comes in when the artist puts his hands on it and creates his vision of what, or she, of what she wants it to be. So in this case, I'm creating like a little bit of extra texture on his little ear. And I'm, again, using the very bristly, rough bristly brush. It's hog hair bristle brush. They're short bristles. They're very stiff. And it allows me to get that texture of his fur in there pretty easily. So if you don't have hog hair bristle brushes to use with your oil paints, I would highly recommend it, because they do make a big difference when you're trying to paint and get texture and things like that. You just have more control, in my opinion. There are times when I want to use the delicate nature of a synthetic, which is like your liner brushes are almost always synthetic because you want the brush to flex very easily. So now, I don't know if you noticed, I put a little shadow section in his cheek area so that way I could kind of create that definition so it's not all just one flat color. Your painting should have transitional colors literally like every square millimeter, especially on something this small. On a big painting, you're not going to have quite as much, but you still need a lot of transitional colors to show variation so that things don't look flat. Okay, so now I'm creating a little bit of definition around his nose and using some of that to kind of blend, because it's that bluish color, so I can create that blue merle color right around his eye. And again, just very lightly and delicately touching the surface of the painting so that way I can create just little individual marks with it. And then if I don't like it, I can go back and touch it with my finger. I can use a different clean brush. I can change it and alter it, and I can make it be what I want it to be. When you're an artist, what you want to do is you want to kind of go at something and create it the way you want it to look to your eye and make sure that it is pleasing to your eye. And that's going to take quite a bit of practice. And in the beginning, when you're first learning how to paint, you have to give yourself a really big amount of grace because it takes time to learn all of this. And so it's not going to come out quite the way you want it to, the first couple times. But the more you practice, the better it's going to come. So now I'm working on his little tail. I'm using kind of like a mid-tone gray with ultramarine blue, cerulean blue, a little bit of the alizarin crimson, and a little bit of white. And then I went a little bit more cerulean blue and white to create those highlighted spots on the top of his foot and the top of his tail. And I want to create a little bit of that top of that foot. So I'm using something slightly darker than that really light patch to create a little shape on his foot. And just very carefully kind of laying the paint in there. I want a fair amount of paint on my brush so that way I can get it to stick to the canvas. And just very delicately putting the brush on. Notice I'm holding the paintbrush pretty far back towards the end. You can't even see my hand. A lot of beginner painters, they will kind of choke up on the paintbrush and hold it like a pencil, and you really don't want to do that. You want to think of it more as a composer's baton. So you're holding it further back. So that way, a lot of that's so that you can get some perspective on what you're doing. It's like, and now I'm coming in a little tighter with my grip on the paintbrush, so that way I can get in a little bit tighter, because these are more precise marks and a little less expressive here. Because I'm working in a pretty small area. Just really dialing in those markings and adjusting as I see them, so that way I can get them as I want them. Now on his face here, it's a pretty bright white right there on that side. And I'm going to mix and lighten some of that area over there. Now I'm redefining the area right on the top of his leg. And this is a very bright white. And it's pure titanium white. So I'm getting that in there as the highlights, as the light is catching that edge of his shoulder and the top of his foot, and just up along that area along his face. And again, I'm flicking the brush to create a varied texture, so I'm simulating the hairs. And I'm putting that bright white on the top of his head as well, so that way you can create that really bright white on the front of his little face. And I'm essentially kind of carving out the shape of his face with the brush and with the colors that I'm using, almost as if I were sculpting it. So I'm using lighter colors where I want it to be bright, and where things start to fall into shadow, I have to shift the color down into a little bit deeper tone. And I'm flicking the brush wherever I have fuzzy hair on the dog, and I'm using tighter brush strokes where it's really fine bristles. But here I want to show a lot of fuzz and a lot of texture on his leg and on his chest because he's a very fuzzy little guy. And so I'm just using that brush to its best advantage to really get that texture of that fur in there. It's hard to see in the video, but when you look at the painting, you can really see the natural texture of the brush strokes and the paint on the painting, which creates the illusion of hair. So it's not just the paint and the colors and all that, because when the paint has ridges, it will create natural shadow lines wherever the paint is applied to the painting in thicker areas. And right by the fluff on his little toes, I'm definitely adding some more of that nice thick white paint because this area is highlighted. And everywhere that I see bright areas, I'm going to want to kind of create that highlight. Now on the edge of his toes, I'm going to create a little bit of a slightly gray area, so I'm using the brush to flick around his pads to simulate the idea of fur. Softening the edge over here by his shadow and creating a little bit more shadow line. And I did notice that that the paw on the right hand side is up higher than the paw that's on the left. I end up correcting this later because I realized that that's inaccurate because the paw that's on the right side is closer to the viewer and so naturally would come down further towards the bottom of the painting than the way I have it currently. So you will notice at some point that I shift that. And the way that I do that is I believe I end up shortening up his paw on the left side. Putting a little fur markings around here, which is again that dark ultramarine blue, burnt umber, and a little tiny bit of white. And now I'm using a warm gray to fuss with the pattern that's on his, I guess you would call it his neck. So I'm creating that illusion that there's the hair that's swirling around by using a couple different shades of gray. I'm using warm gray, and when I say warm gray, I mean it's got a little bit more brown tones in there instead of the ultramarine blue. So it's the burnt umber in there instead of the ultramarine blue. And I've even put a little bit of the alizarin crimson to help it lean a little bit towards the purple spectrum and create just that shift in color from the highlight to the mid-tone to the deeper shadow. And I'm putting that wherever I want to sculpt his paw and the shape of his paw as I want it. This is all about using very subtle shifts in colors, light or dark, so that way you can convey that roundedness. If you've ever had to paint a sphere, you will definitely understand that a lot of times it's very subtle differences in tonal values from light to dark that conveys the roundness of something. It's not often that there's abrupt changes in colors, except maybe like where the pad is, where you've got a very defined shape that's almost black, and then against the white of the paw. Like the whole arm is very cylindrical, so you can think of painting a cylinder, if you've ever painted a cylinder in like beginning classes. It's very subtle shifts and changes going from highlight to mid-tone to darker mid-tone to darker mid-tone to shadow. Now again, I'm creating a little bit of texture here with that patch, that dark patches where his fur is, and adjusting things. Creating a little bit more texture and tone around that dark spot on his shoulder. And I brought in a little bit of that tawny brown color that's darker in shadow down there, and I'm putting a little bit on the edge of his face to create the outer boundary of that. That has a little tiny bit of alizarin crimson in it, and a little bit more white. And I'm shifting back to a slightly more orange version of that tawny color to work on his left cheek, or the left side of the painting. And I'm going to use a little bit on the right side, and then I'm going to switch colors and shift it to a little bit darker or lighter depending on what I see. Lighter in this case. As it goes down towards the edge of his face, it gets lighter and lighter. And again, just creating that texture. Now I used something that was a little bit too red. So if that happens, just wipe off your brush. And then a lot of times with oil paint, you can just take it and just shift it into the rest of the color, and then it'll brighten it up a little bit too. So I actually didn't mind. Sometimes when you make a mistake, you can use that mistake, for the good. So you can take that color and be like, oh, okay, I kind of like that color. Let's add it and sprinkle it around where I want it to be. So I'm using the alizarin crimson with a little bit of white and a little bit of ultramarine blue to create some of those darker patches. And right on the front of his paws, there was some orangey color to create the light that's kind of attaching and glowing on the fronts of his paws. And right on that little eyebrow, getting those little eyebrows in there because he had cute little tawny colored eyebrows. Now I'm working on that patch underneath his chin, redefining that area. And I've got a little bit of blue in my paint to show that it's in shadow, and more white. So cerulean blue and white to create some slightly brighter shadowed areas. So I'm just kind of carving around some of his leg there so I can create the illusion of the three-dimensionality. And I want it bright, because that shoulder is facing the light more than some of the other areas. So I want it to be pretty bright in that area. So that's pretty much just a tiny bit of cerulean blue and white. And now I'm combing a little bit of that and coaxing a little bit of that gray color down into some other areas, and I have ultramarine blue added to the mix now to create and shift some colors to some darker tones to fuzz around the little spots and to create a little bit of dimension and some spots like just starting to go off the edge of his body. And again, to shift the colors. And so I'm using that ultramarine blue, cerulean blue, alizarin crimson, and white combination. It's kind of a middle range gray, and it's kind of a purpley gray, and I'm redefining some of the shapes based on this shadow color, and creating some texture and putting some areas in to have just a little bit more definition. Rounding out that area of his chest, we have a little bit more dimension. Softening some of the edges on some of the brush strokes. Redefining shapes. Checking in with my photograph, my reference photo, softening edges. Now I've regathered a different color here, so now I'm using that orange color, but I've got some white added to it, so it's a little lighter. So I can kind of create the illusion of some hairs. I'm still using the number 4 filbert. Notice I haven't used too many different brushes. You know, a lot of times you think you've got to have a lot of different brushes to paint, and you a lot of times don't. Sometimes I can paint an entire painting with like 3 or 4 brushes, and that's it. Especially when you're working in small, tight areas, you're going to be using smaller brushes, so that way you can have a little bit more control. Because you don't want to bring in a big brush where you're doing an eyeball or a nose, or you're going to have a big blob of paint where you don't want it. So using some of that mid-tone shadow color, I'm just going to create some more texture where I want it. I'm assessing the painting, I'm looking at the painting, deciding on where I want to put some marks and what color I need them to be. So I add in some mid-tone grays to create a little bit more dark area between those 2 front paws because it's kind of shielding the light. Shifting color again. A little bit more blue to create that blue merle coat pattern up there on the top. Adjusting and shifting. Redefining some of the hairs up there. Creating texture. I don't know if you notice how often I shift colors, but I'm shifting colors almost constantly. So every time my hand goes off the camera, I'm shifting colors. Lighter, darker, you know, grabbing the orange, grabbing the, you know, the slightly bluish tone, a lighter blue tone, a darker blue tone, because literally there's just a constant shifting of colors. So you have to, you know, put a color down, put a mark down, and check it against your inspiration photo, but then more importantly to your eye. So when you're painting and you're putting all those marks down, you assess what you've done according to your eye. Does it look pleasing to your eye? Does it look the way you want it to? Are you capturing what you want? Okay, now we're going to start the background color, which I've used ultramarine blue, a little tiny bit of cerulean blue, and a little bit of alizarin crimson to create a nice medium gray tone that's cool. This is representing the asphalt that the dog is sitting on, so I'm getting it underneath his paws. And to paint this, I am using a number 10 flat. This gives me a nice broad area on which to paint with, and the canvas is a little bit wrinkled on the left-hand side, but once I mount it with some adhesive onto a panel, that'll go away, so I don't have to worry about that. So I'm going to be using this color that I mixed, and I'm going to get it all around his paws. Notice I'm being very careful in how closely I'm bringing that color to his fur. This painting is still very wet, and so as I bring the color to parts of the dog, it's going to want to mix. So you have to be very careful in where you're putting your brush so it doesn't grab that when you don't want it to. And what will happen is it'll just smear everything. You'll lose all your definition that you spent a lot of time. Now I'm redefining the area just under his paw by putting a darker color. So I've added a little bit more ultramarine blue here. So that way I can create a shadow. And because of the alizarin crimson and the ultramarine blue, it is a warmer blue. And I'm dragging that shadow kind of off the edge, and I'm gauging how long I want that to be based on the light and how strong I want to indicate that light, the angle of the sun, and so on and so forth. Because as I drag that shadow out, I'm basically telling the viewer how high the sun is. So the tighter the shadow is to the body, that means that the sun is very high, versus if the shadow is long, that means that the sun is much lower on the horizon than if the shadow were short. Does that make any sense? Hopefully it does. And now I'm just kind of blending in some different of the tones. I went back to the original asphalt color, which is kind of just that gray, that bluish gray color. And I'm going to very carefully, you can't see it because my hand is blocking and I apologize, but I'm being very careful. In fact, I'm actually taking it from the dog and pulling it away. See how I put the brush next to the dog and then pull it away. This way I don't have to worry about running over the dog's paw with the paint, so that way it doesn't blend all in there and make a mess. Okay, taking that same asphalt color towards the back of the dog, holding it up to the edge of the dog and then pulling it away from the dog. And there's this little tail. So I'm curving around his tail. And he's really starting to take shape. And when you start putting in the background, the painting really starts to feel much more finished. The dog isn't floating in the air anymore. So you want your horizon line, your lines to be even left to right. And the painting's at an angle, so it may look a little bit off. Bringing in that shadow color, extending the shadow color to represent the dog shadow all the way across. And I'm just running it off the edge of the painting. I have this particular canvas that I've taped off with 1/4 inch wide tape. So that way it'll put a nice little border around it. Now I'm using a white that I've added just a tiny little bit of cadmium yellow medium and a tiny little bit of cadmium red medium and a little tiny bit of alizarin crimson. So it's basically a tinted white. It looks almost like a really, really pale peach. And that was in the background of the painting. I'm pretty sure that represents the curb up against the asphalt. Everything was beautifully blurred out in the photo, which I really wish I knew who the photographer was, because it was a beautiful photograph. And if you happen to know who the photographer was, please add it to the comments, because I would love to add credit to the photographer. Right now I'm using actually a filbert. It's a pretty big filbert. I believe it's a number 12. So I'm using it on, notice I'm using it on its edge so I can kind of come to a more chiseled point and make a thinner area where I want it to as I'm coming up against the dog. And then I'm just going to kind of extend that color up as I see it. It's a really, really pale, pale, pale pinkish peach, almost like a shell pink. These are what I like to refer to as tinted whites, because there's really very little color in them. So I'm just very carefully going around the leg of the dog so I can put that in there, bring the paint across, and then I'm going to end up blending. Notice how I'm blending, which makes it blurry. You can do this beautifully with oil paint, and you cannot do that with acrylic paint quite so easily. So I've added cadmium red with a little bit of cadmium yellow and some white. It was a fall scene behind the dog, but again, everything was obscured. So I'm going to put in just kind of blobs of color here and there. So I've got the red on my brush, and then I'm shifting to a little bit more yellow, and I'm creating the definition of the foliage behind there. So now I've added a dark green. To make the dark green, all I used was ultramarine blue, cadmium yellow, and that creates a really rich dark green. And I've taken a little bit of that red color that I'm mixing behind the dog, and I mixed that into the green to desaturate it even a little further. And I'm just using that big fat old filbert brush to kind of get nice round shapes that are very just kind of nondescript, because I really want the background to be very obscured, very abstract, and just kind of giving the illusion that what is behind there is foliage, but it's all completely out of focus, so that way you're looking at the dog and not really paying too much attention to what's going on in the background. And I'm shifting colors almost constantly. I've added a little bit more red now into that green. So it's kind of a green with a fair amount of red in there, and I'm shifting that around to wherever I want it, putting it up next to the dog's ear. Notice I'm angling the brush towards the dog. Shifting colors again, a little bit more of that reddish green color to create the illusion that there's the fall foliage back there. And now I'm starting to blend a lot of these colors so that the shapes and the different colors become very obscure and you can't really tell where one ends and another one begins. Bringing it down to his cute fuzzy little head. Shifting, shifting, mixing, shifting. And at this point, it's just slogging in the background. I've added a little bit more yellow, a little bit more white to create some lighter areas. And notice how I'm flexing the brush to get a lot of different movement and just really vague, nondescript shapes in there. And then I'm going to end up using a different drier brush. It's a filbert. It's a very thick, very misshapen filbert that's really good at blending. You can use any dry brush that has a fair amount of bristles in it to kind of blend these shapes together and create a lot of nice soft edges. So they just blur in together. Now I'm using a brighter green right near his head, which means that it's got less red in it and more just the ultramarine blue and the cad yellow medium. And see, that's that big filbert brush that I was talking about. Now this will just really blend everything in nicely. I don't want to go too close to the dog because it will just make a mess out of the dog. So I'm going to have to go in more tightly with a smaller brush to kind of get a little bit of control there so that way I just blend into the dog's ears nicely. And that's, again, one of the beauties of oil is that you can do that. So I can take a nice smaller brush and come in tight to his ears, but then I can blend gently just the edges so it kind of allows that soft edge between the dog and the background. So that way you've got this just beautiful shifting of, the hard edge of the dog's ears to the background. Instead of the hard edge, it becomes a nice soft edge. Adding in a little bit more red. Again with that nice big filbert brush. Adding in plenty of red paint that's got a little bit of white in it, a little bit of green in it. And I'm just going to kind of shift it around and get the colors that I want where I want them. And this, at this point, is all just kind of slogging it in there. You get a little bit more careful when you're around the dog's head. So right now I'm just shifting colors as I see fit, lighter, darker. I'm going to add some more of that yellow color with the white in it. And here's a really dark patch. So that's a lot of ultramarine blue, a little tiny bit of yellow to make a very deep green. Added a little bit more yellow to shift it to a lighter, slightly lighter green. I'm using that big filbert brush as a mop brush to kind of just soften everything, blend it, make it a nice abstract background. Coming in on an angle with the filbert so that I can get in between the dog's hairs and still create that shape. And then I shift it again to just soften everything really nicely to make it come in there just really, really nicely. Now I've added the yellow and the white, and I'm blending it into that real pale peach color. Bringing it in closer to the dog, shifting, bringing it in just on the edge there. Add a little bit more yellow. Again, remember, every time I take my brush away, I'm shifting to a different color. Add a little bit more yellow, make a little brighter there, and I'm going to end up shifting these colors a little bit more. As you can see in the final painting, it's definitely, you know, it has some variations even in this area here that I'm working on. We're getting pretty close to done. I'm going to add the red ball before this painting is done. And unfortunately, I did not actually capture that all on video. But what I just did is I just took a nice small round filbert brush, which I believe is a number 4 filbert, and kind of spun it around in a circle with some medium red paint to get the circle where I wanted it. And then I just started adjusting the color on the ball, as you would with any sphere, with the dark tone away from the light, the mid-tone, which is the main color of the ball, and then the highlights. Okay. Right now I'm just kind of still working on the background, kind of fussing with it a little bit, and shifting colors. Adding a little bit more of the orange color, which is a mixture of cad red and cad yellow, both medium. Once I have them where I want them, I will then again blend them, as I'm doing now, with the filbert. I think it's like a number 14 filbert. It has very thick bristles though, so it's almost like a mop brush. But it's a little stiffer though, so it creates a little bit of texture too as I'm working this brush around the painting and just softening everything. And now I'm coming down here to soften everything up. And just look how beautifully that oil paint just blends. I mean, you can't do that with acrylic. Certainly, I mean, you can do it right away, immediately when you put it down, but you can't do it 5 minutes later because it'll be all dry. Coming in with a nice finer brush. I believe it's a number 6 filbert. And just kind of redefining some of the area here with the paint. Blending with the big old filbert. And I see on the right hand side I've got some work to do as well, getting down in between there, just softening everything up, making soft transitions between the dog and the background. Redefining that curb again, because I kind of lost a little bit of it. But notice it's still pretty soft in its texture. And in the transition between the background and the curb. Doing the same thing, creating that curve on the right hand side of the painting. Getting that defined in there. And then when I'm done with that, it will be time to add that ball, and this little painting will be all finished, ready for signing. And hopefully you've earned quite a bit of knowledge today, and you know, just watching the process of how I paint. Now, how I paint is maybe not how you paint or how somebody else paints, but it's how I paint, and you can adapt. for that red ball. As I mentioned, I use cadmium red medium and a little bit of alizarin crimson and just used my brush to spin around to get that round circle. You can use a template if you want. And now it's basically just putting a little cylinder in there between his paws. So you've got the dark shadow areas. So I'm going to use a little bit of black in that shadow and create the bottom. And now there's a little reflected light on the bottom of the ball. So I use cad red medium and cad yellow medium with a little tiny bit of white in there to create that reflected light on the bottom in the middle of the shadow. And then I created the highlight using a little bit of the cad red and some white. And then I used just pure cad red medium to get that bright color in the middle part of the ball. So now it's just a matter of tweaking, making it the way I want it, bringing some of that red down a little further. And I'm going to end up adding a little bit more of the light color on there using a nice small brush. I believe that's, I think that's a number 4 flat. Taking the white and adding that highlight. And then we're basically done. And here we have the finished painting. So if you enjoyed this, please like and subscribe. And stay tuned. I'll be hopefully posting more videos as I get better at making them. Thanks so much. Have a great day.